Hello everybody, it's The Worm, and I'm back with Raging Loop. Yes, last time we left off at a choice, and we're going to get to that. But before diving back in, I want to talk about a few things. Just sort of want to address some of the comments from last time. I think a few people were saying that Kyo was kind of harsh on himself. And I would generally agree with that. He really put himself down with regard to if he would be a good leader or not. But really, I think it's been shown throughout all the different routes thus far that he is trying to win in his capacity as a human. And you know, whether or not he makes the right judgment call with that, you can debate that. But there, throughout these different routes, it's not like he's ever, like, he defers to other people that maybe have more confidence or more leadership skills just naturally, like Hashimoto or Kanzo or Yasunaga or even Takumi. Like he never Like he will, especially at times when the different characters kind of get on his case for being a member of the head families. Like in that case, he'll defend himself or Rikako, but otherwise, he doesn't always. It's not like he's always undermining everyone or being a thorn in our sides. And there have been a few moments where he can be pretty sharp. Like I recall during Darkness, there were a couple times where I think there were a couple times he voted for us, and we were a wolf, and it was just him sort of, he wouldn't take things at face value. He would look at, the different possibilities of whether or not we were lying. So I think I generally agree with the idea that he's a bit too harsh on himself. So that was one common thread that people were talking about. The other thing I want to talk about was I had there was a moment last episode where I was talking about the Dreamer, and I think I came across as a bit too rambly. I think, well, part of the issue is, I'm playing this blind for the first time, so it's just kind of a stream of consciousness sort of thing where a thought will enter into my head, and so I just vocalize it, and I try to. So it's not like I've had time to sort of think it all the way out. I'm just going with it, that kind of thing. So I've had a bit more time to think about that, and so I guess what I was concerned about. Yeah, everyone basically said, okay, if you're worried about an omniscient dreamer, well, you shouldn't be, because they would have already known, and it's silly to just worry about that now. So I guess more what I was trying to get at was, I was curious as to, what the dreamer's goal is, and then sort of what are the further mechanics of how this dream works. So let me try to be a bit more coherent than I was last time. So I guess going down the train of thought that I was on, the idea is the dreamer is responsible for the dream and wants a specific outcome, that being the monster, okay? And the dreamer is not able to get it immediately, and thus has to resort to this looping phenomenon within the dream in order to get that result. So in a sense, maybe the dreamer is the reason why Chiemi has her memories of the previous loops, because the dreamer needs some way to cause changes, in order to get the outcome that they want. Now I was worried, and Haruaki was worried too, I think, during that conversation with Kyo. He was worried about saying too much if if Kyo turned out to be the true culprit. Now, Haruaki said that probably wasn't very likely, and I agree with that. I don't think Kyo is the true culprit. It was just sort of as an example. Like, for example, if Kyo was the true culprit, we wouldn't want to tell him about either the sheep or the monster, I think. But now that I've had a bit more time to think about it, I don't think it would be necessarily that bad if the dreamer found out that Haruaki was looping too, because we're at a point in time where the dreamer... Yeah, here's another question that I got to. Does the dreamer know precisely how to accomplish their objective? Because you'd think if they knew precisely the steps they needed to take in order to bring about that monster, you'd think they would have done it already, or would be trying to take those steps. And yet, so far, all they've had to rely on is doing these loops over and over and over again, hoping that it eventually happens, right? So that led me to think, well, maybe the dreamer maybe the dreamer has this method and they know the outcome they want, but they don't necessarily know the specific steps to get to that. So if that's the case, it may be alright if Haruaki lets the dreamer know, whether directly or indirectly, that he knows previous loops. Because, I mean, we saw the outcome of that in Darkness. Haruaki being aware of the loops eventually led to what the dreamer wanted. So, I don't think I have to worry as much as I was worrying. I think the only information that we need to prevent the dreamer from knowing is the sheep and the, letting the dreamer know the specific route that the monster emerged from. So, yeah, basically, that little rambly part of the last episode it's just, I'm not sure I fully understand all the mechanics of the dream or precisely how the dreamer works, and I was just trying to think through that a bit. So, obviously, I still don't understand that. It's when you finish a story and are looking in retrospect, a lot of it seems obvious, but at least for me, while I'm within the story, I still don't. I'm still trying to grasp all that's going on here. Okay, that's pretty much all I wanted to say. Last time was kind of fun bonding with Kyo, and we're gonna get back into that now. So let me go ahead and get there real quick. Okay. We are back in here. So, we went to go bond with Uncle Kyo. We bonded over a song and some which is apparently made up, by the way. And we had a good old conversation. We were very frank with him. We told him we knew all about the looping, and our very detailed account seemed to convince him. And so we are now searching through the Nosato mansion, hoping to find some secrets, because apparently the previous Nosato head, I think his grandfather was mysteriously killed. Well, potentially killed, poisoned, we think. And so apparently the Nosato were actually opposed to all this feast business, and so perhaps he was killed in response to that. So we went to this basement area in I think the basement of the storage building, and we found this little thing down here. This little thing. And I did, in fact, go back to, I believe someone suggested going back to the argument between Kyo and Mochi, and that within the Darkness chapter, route. And I did go back to that discussion, and yes, I found the order. I don't have to save scum. I took a picture of it. Let me read it real quick. Okay, so Mochi said, "Devour the claws and steal the skills. Devour the eyes and steal the writings. Devour the tongue and steal the words. Offering those up to Fujiyoshi shall be as the will of the crow." So, presumably, that means the answer is press claw, then eye, then beak. So let's try it.
確か、爪を食ってはどうの、目を食ってはどうの、くちばしを食ってはどうのという感じだったはずです。
Although I am curious, I might have to come back here and see what it's like to get a wrong answer. Like, is there going to be a weird trap or something? Huh.
そうか。それでやってみよう。
He quickly pressed the buttons as I told him. A moment later, a part of the wall turned 90 degrees. We're in officially Scooby-Doo territory now. It opened up a space through which an adult, though probably not Hashimoto-san, could pass.
お好きだったんでしょうね。こういう仕掛け。
いやはや、なんとも恥ずかしい。しかし、その血がなせる技か。私も少々、興奮してきたことを否めんがね。
大丈夫です。僕もです。
We bantered nonchalantly despite the dire situation. Once we made it inside, we had to pass through some hanging dried herbs. Do we say herbs or herbs? I can't even recall the, I'm American, and yet I can't recall how we say it in America. I think we say herbs. I think we pronounce the H. I don't remember. Hopefully they don't say it too many more times.
なんだこれ。音切り草かなんかですか？
St. John's wort.
君もディープだな。虫除けになる草が束ねてあるだけだ。気にしたもうな。なるほど。君の言うように、書庫のようになっているようだ。狭苦しいが、奥行きはかなりあるか。
Okay, what deep dark secrets shall we uncover?
めぼしいところから見ていきましょう。
代々の当主の記述あたりが出るといいんだが。
ありましたよ、日記帳。
早速かね。ちょっと貸してくれたまえ。
Ooh, my goodness. Look at this. Scrapbook, scrapbook, scrapbook. Perhaps if you could read Japanese, you could read that. Huh. So are those newspaper clippings? Interesting. Like we expected, the thick diary had writings left by all the previous heads of the Nosato family. That's quite something. It began with his great-grandfather, and the others added more after their retirement. Okay, so, not as many as I thought. Just, 3 generations back? Father, grandfather, great-grandfather? Yeah, I thought we were talking ancient times here, but no. Yeah, and the others added more after their retirements. All of them had strange handwriting, and according to what Kinosuke could make out, it was a highly detailed document and that had references to other texts here. You could really tell it belonged to a family of scholars. What, do we have a lot of footnotes and references? The index on the diary referred to the documents all over the room. And the diary itself was like a description of what went on behind the scenes in Fujiyoshi. Okay. Kinosuke great-grandfather was a genius who gathered immense wealth, but also a madman who threw it all away. His writings were especially difficult to read, analyze, and understand. However, the feeling behind it couldn't be more obvious. It was anguish. Anguish at the fact that he'd found a rational solution and began to doubt the superstitions. The preamble went something like this. Why do we submit to Great Lord Shinai? Outsiders would see our beliefs as pure madness. Even so, we take the passion we should direct to our parents and children and instead dedicate it to our faith. That alone would not mean much, but when you see the shadow of Great Lord Shinai over our daily lives, we become fearful and absolutely loyal to him, like well-trained dogs. This slavery of the mind will still shackle us when the era of enlightenment reaches our home. That is why I have decided to take up the will of the crow I so neglected and begin my research. I hope that it bears fruit, and mankind, not God, benefits from it, breaking free of the centuries of ignorance. This was written by Kinoskishi's great-grandfather shortly after his role as head was passed down, and when he was still in his healthy 40s. Upon reading this, Kinoskishi looked conflicted. The great-grandfather he thought to be a madman was actually both reasonable and intelligent. I also had something to think about it. He'd challenged God. That absurd endeavor might have been the reason why he'd gone mad. The diary had 3 sections. In the first one, the great-grandfather tried to pinpoint the origin of Fujiyoshi. He wanted to find the invisible change binding him by looking at where they started and where they were going. However, that was difficult. Trying to find documents of Fujiyoshi would have attracted the attention of the other families, particularly the Miguruma, who'd then obstruct his work. Our legends say that we were protected by Shinai-sama. By looking for proof claiming otherwise, we would be betraying his compassion, and that was the height of disrespect. It was also a time when not everyone went to schools, and literacy levels were really low. Thus, most of the records were held by the head families. However, there was no record of one of them trying to check another family's records, and that would obviously be met with opposition. Thus, he looked at historical documents from outside Fujiyoshi. With the settlement being such a strange place, he figured that there would be many records about it made by outsiders. He was completely right. There were lots of old writings in the nearby villages and towns. Since it was wartime and the economy was dire, the paper was about to be wasted on fixing sliding. He used his own funds to acquire these precious documents. They were now organized and placed somewhere in the room, but anyway, he was able to locate Fujiyoshi's roots. It happened 600 years ago, during the Muromachi period, a bit before the Sengoku. According to the documents, the place now known as Kamafujiyoshi began as a hunter settlement. This place was a hunting ground for centuries. Game meat had only spread among the common people during the Meiji period, but the country folk had been eating it for a long time before that. At first, it was just a settlement of cabins for the hunters from nearby villages to rest or shelter, and places to skin and prepare meat. But once the people realized how rich the area was in game, they began to colonize the place. As a result, a part of Kamafujiyoshi was born, and the people began living here as either farmers or hunters. The settlement had no name yet. However, these extremely old documents refer to it as Okami Village, or something similar. Not Okami as in Okami-sama though, but Okami as in wolves, the canine beast. Apparently, this place really had wolves before. Not mountain dogs or badgers, but actual wolves. That was no secret, though. The Shinai Shrine was run by the Shinai Shrine run by the Miguruma had actual wolf bones in it. However, according to the documents, during the settlement's development, the place was often attacked by wolves that caused major damage. They'd probably tried many things to deal with them, but the documents wrote down one very simple method. The people of the wolf village prepared a human sacrifice and consigned them to flame. Human sacrifice. It was a practice that had existed in Japan for a long time. During construction and whatnot, people would be killed and buried as offerings to prevent misfortune. I'd heard of human sacrifices made to prevent bridges being taken away by floods, or people burying during castle fortification. It was a pretty big deal. Yeah, I've heard of that too. I've heard it in Mesoamerican contexts, like Aztecs or different places like that. But it's not just them. I'm sure it's a common idea or practice that in many parts of the world. Still, it wasn't weird to do it to prevent a beast-related problem. It did seem like a plausible story, so I wasn't surprised. Neither of us were specialists, but from what I knew, people tried to benefit from sacrifices by later on worshipping them as gods. I'd even heard that the pillar kanji used to count gods was based on the term for human sacrifice. Huh. Anyway, following the sacrifice, the beast attacks subsided, and the settlement continued to grow. At this point, the upper settlement was known as Okami Village, now Kamafujiyoshi. Excuse me. At this point, the upper settlement, once known as Okami Village, now Kamafujiyoshi, was surrounded by cabins and other settlements. Through irrigation, these settlements gathered water from the Wolf Village. One of these settlements was a dangerous place that was often covered in mist that led people to their deaths, and for some reason, locals found it really important. Kinosuke Shi, his great-grandfather, and myself figured that it had to be Yasumizu. And if they took water from Kamafujiyoshi, it wasn't hard to imagine that the hierarchical relationship between the settlements had already existed then. In agricultural societies, the settlements that controlled the supply of water were extremely influential. After all, if they stopped the flow, the settlements below would dry out. It was even related to the Yasumizu rebellion that Kinosuke Shi told me about. I couldn't ignore this point. Though there was no mention of Yasumizu or the local superstitions yet. All the documents said that the Wolf Village was steadily progressing as a settlement. However, there was a mention of a fearsome beast yokai or god that ate people. Though it was only mentioned in the oldest documents, then never heard from again.
神、力なき神。それだけじゃわからないんですよ。伝承にはあなたのような存在は。待てよ。無事な。不快な呼び名なのでしょうか。
別に正しいことじゃ。こうして神内明神の印をつけて畜生どもの頭目として振る舞っておる我にこそふさわしい呼び名であろう。どうせなら我のもとに下ってみられぬか。十里四方のケチな領地じゃが退屈はさせませぬぞ。
It had to be God. She, said she was defeated by Great Lord Shinai, but never mentioned when it happened.
神の武士は示す編。実際に給仕は神だし、つまりこれは狼。
I was close to the truth. But for now, back to history. Fujiyoshi had started out as your typical hunting farming settlement. Things changed after about a century, when life in the settlement had stabilized. By this point, the records left by the outsiders started noting that there was a strange village in the mountains. The sources had started to become many and varied too. I was curious about how the great-grandfather got documents from Kyoto and Tohoku. Tohoku? Tohoku or Tohaku. Don't know. But anyway, these reports were records written by travelers who'd stopped here. Many of them were interested in local customs. One was their hate for mountain fires. It was so bad that outsiders weren't allowed to make any flames, and they themselves had a special watering hole where they did it. One was their worship of a humanoid wolf statue. They asked it for good fortune in the hunt and a peaceful life in the mountains. One was the special misty place where travelers were summoned and welcomed by sensual women. Some rumors mentioned seemed hardly believable, but some of them were still alive, and I was surprised to know how old they were. What bothered me was the fact that there were many records of the invitations to the Misty Place, but nothing about getting killed there. In fact, most of them mentioned eating good meat and veggies, and drinking good sake while having fun with the beautiful girls. It was safe to assume that the Feast of the Yomippurge hadn't existed back then. It was closer to the traditional treatment of guests as described by Rikako-san.
ちなみに、マロードっていうのは何か来訪者をもてなす文化みたいなものがあるのですか？
はい。そもそもかつての藤吉は狩りの安全の祈願のため神内大社を訪れる人で賑わったと聞きます。遠方の狩人を村人はマロードと呼び手厚くもてなしたと言います。
However, there was one thing she seemed to be wrong about. The strange village in the records was in a completely different place than the one built around the Shinai Shrine she spoke of. Shinai Shrine Shi. In fact, there wasn't a single mention of Shinai at this point. The general area here was marked as Kashihara. Would things change if we continued further? Anyways, we kept reading. Such records continued for 2 or 3 decades, but then there was a period that wasn't recorded at all. Apparently, the travelers who made their way to this area started being chased out, and that was it. The settlement suddenly became isolated. Without any documents from the village itself, it was hard to know exactly what happened during this time. But according to the Nosato documents, this time period was how far they could trace their lineage back. After that, the settlement showed up in records another century later. It was the middle of the Edo period, peaceful times, and the amount of records appeared to have exploded, along with the name Shinai. There is a hidden mountain where the people worship a wolf-faced god and prosper because of it. It is said that the hunters who do not pay their respects to him get lost or are injured in the mountains. It is a spiritual place that a mountain ascetic should visit at least once. Their prayers seem to heal all. There are oracles who can predict the future with great accuracy. The non-believers who step on the mountain are in for a terrible fate. The name of the god they worship is Shinai, and the village is called Fujiyoshi.
そういうことだったのか。
I lurched forward and shouted with excitement.
確かに、かつてこの村は不死吉と呼ぶのが正しかったと聞くが、何がそういうことなのかね。
神内さんと同じ仕掛けですよ。神内という字をばらして組み替えると狼になる。
Sorry, I was looking at the kanji here. So that's this, goes there. That's this, goes there, and that goes there. Okay.
おお、本当だ。待て、それと同じだと。
不死吉、伏せの字は人弁に犬。犬は部首としては剣部です。これには獣編も含まれる。それに量を並べるんです。
Fushiyoshi. If you broke apart the first kanji, you'd get person, dog, and good. Then by combining the latter 2 kanjis into one and putting the whole thing together again, you got Hito Okami, or werewolf.
人狼、人狼、人狼。それは狼様のことか、それとも 神内明神のことか。
その二つは基本的には同じものです。ある神様の穏やかな層が神内明神で、憤怒層が狼様という程度のもの。三人組の人狼という形があって、やっていることが違うだけ。同一視する方が自然ですよ。
Two sides of the same coin.
そもそも、人狼、人狼を信仰する文脈自体は、この100年前からすでに文献に出ていたわけです。もともと狼による獣害があって、人柱があって、人狼の原始信仰が起こり、長い時を経て、神内様となった。狼様は、このどこかの段階で生まれた信仰対象なのでしょう。そして当初、彼らはそれらが同じものだと自覚していた。藤吉村、いや、伏吉村の人間たちは、自分たちの信仰の特異性を重々承知して、その上で自分たちの村の名にそれを隠した。
なぜ隠したのだろうね。きっとその考察も先にあるはずだが。
ですね。進みましょう。
The great-grandfather seemed to have noticed these hidden words too. The reports that followed generally described Fushiyoshi as it was, though their strange practices were now considered rituals, and it seemed to prosper as a cult village. It was a mountain village, far from the rest of civilization, yet it prospered through the money left behind by guests, who made the trip regardless. There were now two types of guests here. The ones who visited the place to hunt, and the ones that came for religious reasons. The writings from the later dates included lots of those left by monks who came here to study the culture. All of them were surprised by the strange faith and legends of Fushiyoshi, and praised the strength of their belief. Some wrote about the faith in detail. Many of them clearly named the four-head families, and a legend about the five guardians. The hunters, however, didn't leave many writings. Or rather, it wasn't even their writings. Besides a couple reports by local lords of someone hunting down large beasts on Mount Shinai, there were also those that simply mentioned men who went hunting from Fujiyoshi, or in Fushiyoshi, and never returned. One of them clearly stated, "Do not hunt in Fushiyoshi in the summer. The people of Fushiyoshi speak of the curse of Yasumizu."
なるほど。明らかに100年の沈黙の間に伏吉という村は変貌している。
ですね。現在残る地名や用語、そして物語の類は全部、この時代に創作されたと考えるべきでしょう。
安水の意味合いも変わっている。ここを訪れるのは漁師だけ。そして帰らない者もいる。つまり
読み意味の宴が始まったのかもしれません。
The history continued. After a while of prosperity due to the Shinai cult, Fushiyoshi began to deteriorate come Meiji. The new government centralized power, rural areas began to be developed, and the religious reforms established Shinto as the state religion. The anti-Buddhist movement of that era planned a complete separation of Shinto and Buddhism, destroying many Buddhist temples, customs, and cultural assets, dealing another blow to the village and its faith. This could easily be found in the Inosato records, but it was admitted here that the Uematsu were particularly damaging for them. Well, there was no denying that the Uematsu culture seemed Buddhist in nature, and the prostitution part must have made them targets of harsh prejudice. The Shinai faith, which had many strange rituals, had to either cease and discard them, or turn them into something more culturally acceptable. However, they did keep a few of them. Before moving on to the next chapter, we put together the region names of Fushiyoshi, which the great-grandfather just rediscovered from the archives. According to him, Fushiyoshi had several districts, each one under the jurisdiction of the village heads. The Miguruma had the Fushiki, where the Shinai shrine was built. The Higuchi had Hoshiziku. That's not that. Hoshizuki, where people gathered. The Nasato had Tomeguchi, the medicinal plant field right beside Kagegawa. And last, the Uematsu were given the Hacho, the lodging area. According to Kinosuke, these regions remained in Kamifujiyoshi to this day. In fact, the names of these regions had existed from the era when the name Fushiyoshi began to spread to the outside, and was the designation Kamifushiyoshi. On the other hand, places aside from Kamifushiyoshi had already been clearly identified and named, such as Yasumizu.
安水でなく、安水。
Rest and Lord.
なるほど。ここへ来て、先々先代も我々と同じ結論に至ったのだな。不識は、櫛。つまり、髪の毛を。星月は、肝。肝臓か。影川の旧表記。影。骨。留め口は、わかりやすいな。足。そして八丁は、爪。上藤吉の地名は、すべて人間の身体に基づいた分割をされている。
そして、安水は、人、木、主に分割して組み合わせれば、
人柱。
His great-grandfather seemed to have no clue about the purpose of the names. However, he did guess that the oldest one was either Fushiyoshi or Yasumizu, while the other names were new. He concluded that link between those names and the words werewolf and human sacrifice was related. There was another thing here. He guessed that Kamifushiyoshi was named after body parts to represent a single human as a way of responding to or opposing Yasumizu. Another guess was that by burying the sentiment in the name instead of burying the people in the ground, they'd avoided killing their own. Honestly, it seemed to me like we didn't have enough to understand the true intention behind this. Though, the fact that they hid the words human sacrifice in Yasumizu was pretty shady. You could assume that it was named that way because it was a human sacrifice meant to help the area, including Kamifushiyoshi, prosper. Or perhaps it was related to the human sacrifice from the origin of the village. Regardless, there were definitely ulterior motives behind the names. As one who knew Yasumizu's future, I was certain of that. Fushiyoshi and Yasumizu had become Fujiyoshi and Yasumizu during the Meiji period and became part of a single area. The great-grandfather concluded that the naming was based on local conventions and that it was meant to hide the village's past. He had nowhere to continue from here, and his writing in the diary ended. Okay. The next section was started by Kinosuke's great-grandfather, but after his writing grew worse and worse and finally stopped, his son took over. According to Kinosuke, his great-grandfather had gotten a mental illness and began acting eccentric. He'd seen it with his own eyes. The final reasonable bits of writing left behind by him cursed his deteriorating mind and hoped that his descendants would take over his research. His wish was fulfilled when Kinosuke's grandfather found this room and took over. This section was primarily made to give detailed descriptions to the outdated rites and customs of Fushiyoshi. Naturally, the lack of historical accounts was a hindrance. However, the documents owned by the Nasato family and the knowledge he gained as the head made it possible to do it. He was also married to someone with ties to the Miguruma, and so he also gained access to the Miguruma records. Having gathered info from various sources, he reached some reliable conclusions, though his efforts to gather information had made him a target of the other head families. His mind also seemed to deteriorate during his twilight years. The final bits of writing in the diary seemed to scream his fear of death. He died on May 1st, 15 years ago. The text here made it evident that he died in the Feast of the Yomi Purge. As the hand of the supernatural looms over us and takes our lives, I realize that I am losing control of my mind. Now that I have seen the might of the god I was to venerate, what duty do I have to continue the previous head's research into the homeland of Fushioshi? I will probably be hanged tomorrow, and in all honesty, it seems like a favorable outcome at this point. What if the irresistible urge to sleep faded, and I opened my eyes to see the wolf-faced god? I would be unable to bear the fear. The wolf's bane I shall use to end my life lies in my hand. And that was it. I'm reminded now that we have this series of Nasato people losing their mind, I'm reminded of the end of Wit. Remember when we completed the feast, left the village, came back, and then we found everyone dead except, who was it? It was Kinosuke, who had the bloody axe and was going insane. So, maybe that's just a coincidence, but it seems interesting now that we have evidence of multiple Nasatos just going insane at some point. And, now that I mentioned that, what was the dreamer doing during that ending, the end of Wit? Because we have evidence of at least one route, or one ending within, I think it was within Wit, where the dreamer supposedly, I think we're assuming here that the dreamer ended the route early. That was when we revealed Mochi was a wolf. So the dreamer can end the loop early when they think it's going nowhere, or presumably that's why they would end it early. So what was the point of having that route go on for longer when the humans won? That's interesting. What would the point of that be? Kinosuke-shi's voice was shaking. From what he said, his grandfather was an intelligent gentleman that he knew personally and respected immensely. Anyway, the text here could be summed up as thus. Fushioshi had several strange rites and customs. When combined with the ones unique to specific head families, the number grew exponentially. It revealed all the details about these things, and even had info we really didn't care about right now. The content about the Uematsu was particularly harsh, even though it was noted that not everything was here. Info about the Miguruma, however, was extremely limited. However, it was said that horrible screams could be heard from their storehouse.
あの日、私はいたずら心で三の蔵の地下の扉を開けた。決して入っちゃいけないと言われた。このお印が刻まれた鉄の扉を。そして。
It was a morbidly interesting read, but there was only one thing that mattered to us. It was the custom of lynching in Yasumizu. It was basically describing the Feast of the Yomi Purge. The Okami-sama would return from Yomi to get revenge for being killed. The story was the same. There were two notable points here. One was that it had apparently begun about 500 years ago, after the village closed itself off from the world. And the other was that Kama Fushioshi was mostly uninvolved in the feasts of that era. Kinosuke-shi's grandfather examined the feast's origin from various angles. He investigated the stones in the Hanging Pines graveyard, looked at the records in Kamifushioshi's mason, and concluded that Kamifushiyoshi were making the graves. And according to the Mason records, the Okiba were placed in Yasumizu at this time too. 500 years of history was enough to make it a historic landmark. But there were no megaliths from the millennia BC. They were simply put there to help turn the village into a great Lord Shinai worshipping holy ground. Words left behind by the elders of Kamifujiyoshi and Yasumizu gave us even more info. There was the legend that, in a time when samurai still existed, Yomibito poured out of Yasumizu and attacked Fushiyoshi. That coincided with the rebellion Kinosuke had mentioned, the reason why the head families oppress Yasumizu. Looking at both documents and word of mouth, the rebellion had happened 5 centuries ago, shortly before the village became isolated. In Yasumizu, the Yomibito were said to be scary creatures, completely covered in blood water. You could find the word blood water by playing with the kanji in the name Saranaga. Blood Water Rapids. The stream was considered corrupted even half a millennium ago. Anyway, though the legend was warped by superstition, there was no denying that Kamifujiyoshi was attacked by people covered in Saranaga mud. The grandfather concluded, without a doubt, that this incident was what made the Kamifujiyoshi people so afraid of Yasumizu. This rebellion was the very cause for the decades of isolation, the creation of the Shinai faith, and the start of the Feast of the Yomi Purge. As for what that meant, it was all planned for the purpose of holding the already discriminated Yasumizu down and preventing further rebellion. The grandfather thought that Yasumizu was purposely created to be discriminated against. It was a bad, dangerous place to live in. The reason why it wasn't abandoned wasn't mentioned here, but anyway, people continued calling it home. In governing, intentionally creating a lower class and treating them poorly satisfied the upper class and thus made their governance easier. It was something you saw all over the world. Even in Japan, there was a complicated historical discrimination that left its mark even on the current era. Thus, the present of a settlement meant to be looked down upon was good for the leaders of that era. However, they didn't want any more rebellions. So how could they stop it? One way was to make them fight amongst themselves. Another was to make them so superstitious they wouldn't even think of rebelling. Basically, they had to make them believe the lie that there were wolves among them who were killing people, causing them to kill each other. By doing that, they would sap any strength Yasumizu needed to rebel. They also prepared a background story, to make them believe that the anomaly was actually real. The grandfather guessed that this was the true purpose of the 5-century-old religion. His sources for that were the documents gathered by his predecessor, which claimed that people from local temples and shrines were called into the village. He assumed that the incomplete or intentionally destroyed records were those regarding the scholars they summoned to help create the religion. That seemed absurd at first, but after thinking about it, was entirely reasonable. The settlement they'd looked down upon had bared their fangs at them, so what did they do? Call the smart people for help. That was natural. And so those scholars teamed up, created a new religion, and made the settlement fight itself. And, if they'd given the head families roles in the legends to ensure proper control, man, it sounded messed up, but it didn't seem impossible.
逆だよ。あれは上藤吉の者が読み人かもしれない安水の者と目を合わさずに済ませるためにつけさせたものだ。
They wanted to avoid eye contact not only because they thought they were corrupted, but also because they were afraid. Kamifushiyoshi was afraid of Yasumizu. It was a possibility I wouldn't have considered before, but it also seemed likely. It'd be pretty scary if the people they looked down upon finally let their grudge take over and became fearful marauders, ready to enact their revenge. And because they were aware of how badly they treated the settlement, the guilt grew even larger, and they started controlling and discriminating against them even further. when you looked at it that way, they'd made the whole religion just to protect themselves. And boy, was that insane. Okay, let's see, what time is it? I don't know how long this is going to be. Let's go a bit longer. Now, with the feast's origin revealed, what was that about the head families not being involved in it so much? Apparently, the first feasts were a lot simpler than the current one. There was a purification, sheltering, dreaming, and the limit of one per day, but there was no actual punishment for breaking these laws. They'd probably set it up to prevent indiscriminate massacres. Also, there was no wolf selection, and there were no guardians. The heads, or Fushioshi leaders of that time, only circulated the Yasumizu legend that the wolves had come back. By spreading the local legend along with the lie, they motivated the people to kill each other whenever the mists appeared. It was successful, and the people started killing suspected wolves every time the mists showed up. In response to that, those who spread the suspicions were brutalized at night. This weakened Yasumizu, left the place a breeding ground for future problems, and too weak to rebel.
待て、そんなバカな、おかしいだろう。そんなことで殺し合いが起きるはずがない。実際の脅威がないのに殺し合いが起きるというのか。
昔は今とは違います。迷信が殺し合いに発展してもおかしくない。先々代さんは初めから死刑という言葉を使ってます。僕はこれが重要だと思う。おそらく読み意味の宴は安水の住人たちにとって役立つものだったんです。
What, so they could get rid of undesirables or something?
どういうことだ。
先に進みましょう。
Sure enough, the grandfather seemed to believe that, to the people of Yasumizu, the feast made the killings into a just cause. According to this, the feast wasn't considered a paranormal event, not even by the Yasumizu people themselves. It was just a justification for lynching. The hand of the law didn't reach this backwards village, and Yasumizu was even more isolated, a settlement for the ostracized. Of course, there had to be conflicts and wrongings, and the social system to solve them was limited. Thus, there was a demand for solutions beyond the law, and the feast fit the bill perfectly. When the mist came, they could easily get rid of people they didn't like. However, that came with the risk of being targeted by their friends and family. This continual cycle of lynchings and revenge eventually destroys the minority and leaves the majority wounded. The feast ends, and the law returns to Yasumizu. It seemed like the ostracism they'd done in ancient Greece. Anyone who was against the law of the village had their names written on pottery and voted to be exiled. A backwards but effective way to keep order. Though, while the punishment there was exile, the feast came with a death penalty. It was clearly unjust, but they found it better than nothing. By having these occasional unlawful disputes, they actually prevented the settlement as a whole from crumbling. Those who participated in the lynchings had their guilt lessened by considering the myths and legends. Superstition had real-world effects. By telling people that they'd be hanged if they were bad, the renegades among them would be silenced. So yeah, the Feast of the Yomi Purge had its perks for both Kami Fujiyoshi and Yasumizu. Also, apparently, it was a long-running tradition for Kami Fujiyoshi to do certain things immediately before the mists came. They summoned the children of Yasumizu to Kami Fujiyoshi and called the women to help them with food. There was no end to these records. It was much like the Mountain Festival, the carrot for the stick they constantly provided the settlement. But it was also a form of population control. They didn't want Yasumizu to be completely depopulated, so they protected the children. This tradition was alive to this day. Even 8 years ago, Tai-san, Kaori-san, and the children had been saved from the feast when they were called. Well, except for that one during World War II, apparently. So, while it had its roots in superstition, the Feast of the Yomi Purge became a kind of social tool.
なるほど。統制されたリンチ。いいな。これはもう合議による死刑制度と言っていいだろう。我々上藤吉の人間に都合のいい形で安水の中で完結する死刑制度。これでは室たちが言うように完全に長者は悪者ではないか。
それはどうでしょう。当時の統治者たちは当時なりの良識感覚で良い統治を目指しただけかもしれない。問題は現代に至るまでその統治が続いてしまっていることですが。
そうだ。今の安水ならこんなことが起きるはずがないのだ。
そう書いてありますか？
戦中戦後に宴は3度あったとされているな。
That lines up with what we know. The feasts meant to manage society had ended with the one that began at the start of World War II. When Kinosuke-shi's grandfather wrote this, he called it the previous feast. The ones who survived it said that an actual wolf had appeared. Also, rules like sheltering, which had been ignored until then, now came with a supernatural punishment. The legend had gone from mere story to reality. The grandfather himself had witnessed some paranormal things too. There was a pile of dog corpses that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. The thorough violent deaths given to the rule breakers. The wolves who could come through locked doors and brutalize the ones inside. And finally, the unity between the wolves, hell-bent on killing the humans even if it meant their own death. That was the feast I knew. The next text was written by the previous head, Kinosuke-shi's father, and he'd observed the third feast of the recent times. It was the one that happened 8 years ago, and its survivors mentioned impossible paranormal events that actually happened. It was the same, the exact same. The feast had been supernatural 3 times in a row, and this was the 4th one. That meant that something had drastically changed with the feast that happened during the war. The reason for that wasn't given here.
大丈夫ですか？ショックだとは思います。少し休みますか？
いや、いい。一気に読んでしまおう。次は我が父が主にまとめた記述だな。
Okay, now I'm gonna take a break. So, although Kyo wanted to continue, I'm gonna take up Haruwaki's suggestion and stop for now because I'm getting close to time. Yeah, okay, so that was a lot. Yeah, the question that kept popping up in my head was, so here's this tradition from centuries ago that's lasted to the modern age. Now, the question I have is, who's the dreamer, and how or why have they hijacked this ancient ritual? Because it's obvious. I had this question for a while now, but then it was obvious at the end when they talked about how the paranormal events started happening at the end of, or during World War II. It feels like something has come along and hijacked this event and is now using it for, you know, whatever nefarious dealings they wish to complete. So I'm sure that's going to be part of the mystery we got to figure out. Okay, next time we'll probably finish up this diary, and then we'll see where the game takes us from there. Okay, I've been The Worm, this has been Raging Loop, and I hope you're all doing all right. Hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.